everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Bev Reed, and I'm a community organizer with Buckeye Environmental Network. We are a environmental justice organization, nonprofit based in Ohio. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the Appalachian Hydrogen Hub. Halt the Hydrogen Hoax webinar is what this is called. And let's jump right into it. The goals for the webinar is we're going to explain what the ARCH2 hub is. We're going to discuss the health and environmental risks with Dr. Randy Pokladnik. We're going to discuss the economic implications for now and in the future with researcher Sean O'Leary with Ohio River Valley Institute. And we're going to provide opportunities for community involvement and next steps. So the ARCH2 hub is essentially another industry pivot because fossil fuels are in decline. The petrochemical boom that was proposed in 2018-ish has fizzled out, and now the companies want to make blue hydrogen from fracked gas to keep the industry afloat. This is a map of the hub, and I will note that it's a tentative map. A number of the companies have dropped out and several projects have not yet been confirmed. And it also includes facilities that have never been affiliated with ARCH2. So just so you have an idea of the region, the scope of the project, and what all would be involved, we will share these slides with folks as well. This is a slide that talks a little bit more about the hub. This is a slide that talks a little bit more about the specifics of the hub, the overview. Production would be thermal conversion. Midstream uses would be hydrogen pipelines, hydrogen fueling stations, and permanent CO2 storage. End uses would be fuel cell electric mining vehicles, heavy duty vehicles, and heavy industry. There are 6 other hubs around the country. The Appalachian hub is just one of 7. And the federal government Department of Energy wants to dole out about $1 billion for each hub. And other significant end uses include home heating and fertilizer. And nearly all of these applications are ones for which hydrogen doesn't make economic sense. So here's another map. The Enbridge Gas Ohio, formerly Dominion Energy Ohio, is here in the North Canton area for electrolytic hydrogen production, storage, and pipelines for use in regional transit. Confirmed for the SARTA, Stark Area Regional Transit Authority. They would be working with that facility there. The Independence Hydrogen Facility is proposed for Ashtabula, Ohio, and that would be hydrogen production from industrial off-gas from an existing chemical facility for heavy-duty equipment. And then Plug Power is confirmed for Etna and North Randall, and they would be storing the hydrogen, refueling stations, fuel cells, and backup power. Again, these maps are constantly changing. There could be more facilities hop online at various places here throughout the tri-state area. And these facilities are not the only places this would affect, because you have the fracking that would be needed. So fossil fuel extraction to the methane reforming or autothermal reforming down to the carbon capture and injection, that process is blue hydrogen. Gray hydrogen is that process without carbon capture and injection, and it currently makes up 95% of US production. Gray and blue hydrogen, both made from climate warming methane, have no place in our region. Green hydrogen is the only truly clean hydrogen there is, and it's not yet market ready. And it's truly clean because it uses renewable energy, and that should only be used for heavy duty, long distance transportation and things like cement, steel, and other industrial applications. Only niche uses, not for passenger vehicles, utility scale power generation, and heating homes and buildings. Here's another slide on blue hydrogen. Again, it would use fracking. The gas pipelines can leak and release methane into the environment. And then you have the CO2 sequestered underground. Just a little graphic to understand a little bit more about that. The industry is attempting to create a demand for something we don't even need. They're looking for ways to stay afloat so they can keep extracting gas and oil. Clean energy is cheaper, more efficient, and more reliable than hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration. And here's a little video if you want to check that out, AppalachianHydrogenFacts.org. And here's a photo from Frack Tracker Alliance of a frack pad. More fracking would be required. Health impacts from oil and gas extraction are plentiful. That would mean more radioactive fracking waste and related infrastructure. And I wanted to plug this book here, Petroleum 238. Justin Noble wrote it. He's an environmental journalist and a great writer, and he writes about this radioactive fracking waste issue nationwide. Here's a photo of Austin Master Services in Martins Ferry, Ohio, that the company piled in tons and tons of waste, well over permitted levels, and they left. And there was an Ohio Attorney General lawsuit last year, and that lawsuit's ongoing, but ultimately the state of Ohio is going to have to pay for this mess. $6 million is what it's going to cost to clean this up. The point of this is we don't need more of this waste stream. It's a real issue for the industry, is the waste stream. And we don't need more of it. We need to focus on other alternative energies instead of perpetuating this. The whole project depends on taxpayer dollars and government incentives. Again, $925 million from the Inflation Reduction Act is what the government put towards this. And there's two different tax credits here for carbon capture and hydrogen. And we're going to talk about those a little later. But just so you know, taxpayer dollars shouldn't be going towards these types of projects. We should be going towards transitioning projects, truly transitioning projects, not these. They use misleading terminologies, and there's a lack of transparency. The hub is not clean. It would use fracked gas, which is far from clean. They're pushing plans through without any transparency on site activities and locations and plans. And they're holding these events without experts, true experts, and the technical questions have gone unanswered. Groups wanting info have to sign a non-disclosure agreement as well. So using hydrogen to power homes and fuel appliances is inefficient and wasteful. It actually takes more energy to create hydrogen and use it than it does to just use natural gas alone. We should be using the energy we have to transition off of fossil fuels. And again, truly green hydrogen should only be used in niche industries. Truly green hydrogen. And here is a graphic here of domestic heating and power generation using non-stored hydrogen is uncompetitive. And then day-to-day power generation, light-duty vehicles and buildings are any terrible uses for hydrogen. Great Britain dropped its plans to use hydrogen to heat homes. This is from an article where the government just basically shelved its plans for their pilot project. They realized that it was just not a good idea. So fuel cell buses are also a bad idea. They're a false climate solution for which there are already better and less expensive clean energy alternatives. They're more expensive than clean energy alternatives, including battery electric buses and hybrid buses. The capital costs are more than twice that of battery electric buses. Hydrogen fuel cell cost per mile is double that of diesel, and they require expensive new infrastructure to deliver and use hydrogen. Battery electric buses are more efficient. They will increase the demand for natural gas and fracking. And here's a picture of a bus that exploded, a hydrogen bus in Korea. This happened recently. So here's a slide on the dangers of carbon capture and storage. It's a greenwashing tool that poses a host of problems. It's unproven at commercial scale. It's really expensive. It enables fossil fuels, may increase emissions, and endangers those who live nearby. Hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration are not done at mass scale yet. There's only 839 projects globally, and only 51 are operational. Most of the rest are just planned. And they rarely, if ever, capture 90% of the carbon emissions. It's experimental, unproven, and dangerous. Class 6 injection wells is what they are called. Our limestones and sandstones have already been drilled for 160 plus years. Migration and contamination are concerns of underground water sources, and our operators and regulators have little to no experience with carbon storage class 6 wells. And here's an image of an injection well that was leaking in Ohio. And the state had to pay $1.3 million to clean it up. And over the past 5 years, there have been over 1,400 incidents associated with oil and gas wells in Ohio. This comes from Frack Tracker Alliance. And here's a map of all the incidents here. So the point here is this is a dirty business, and we need to transition off of these things and not have all these risks involved. It's not good for the climate and atmosphere. Methane leaks from oil and gas extraction, and it's 86 times as potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide in a 20-year period. The industry isn't considering the methane impacts in their hydrogen production. And hydrogen itself is also a greenhouse gas contributor. And here's a stack at a compressor station where they just flare off there. That's from Frack Tracker as well. Upstream emissions are also not considered. So carbon capture and storage does not take into account the upstream emissions from fracking and transport. And it does not address other emissions from industrial facilities like volatile organic compounds, which come from fracking infrastructure. And it distracts us from real climate solutions. Our energy, time, and attention and resources should be spent on transitioning us away from carbon emitting sources. This would prolong the lifespan of fracking at a time we need to transition off of it. Hydrogen makes metal brittle. It's the smallest molecule, and the tanks containing it are heavy and expensive. The pipelines, there's issues and concerns with those. Condensed carbon dioxide can corrode pipelines, particularly if exposed to water. It increases the risk of leaks, ruptures, and explosions. There was a pipeline rupture in Mississippi in 2020 that injured dozens of people, and there's an image from it here. Hydrogen leaks easily, and there is no technology to detect leaks in hydrogen pipelines for long distances. Citizens would pay with their pocketbooks. ARCH2 would lead to higher utility bills, higher prices at the store, or citizens would pay through taxes. It could cost $230 billion to construct hydrogen projects, and the CO2 capture projects could cost up to $100 billion yearly and $1 trillion over 10 years, and that would be added to Americans' electric bills, an increase of 25%. Again, we are saying here that these projects are very expensive, and we have cheaper alternatives already in place that we should be utilizing and expanding. So the hub wouldn't create very many jobs. The ARCH2 hub would see employment increase of only 1% across the 3 states. Major fracking counties in eastern Ohio lead the state in job losses and population loss. And you can read that more about that here in this report by the Ohio River Valley Institute. It requires a ridiculous amount of water. Fracking alone requires a lot of water throughout the process, and so does hydrogen production. Even green hydrogen uses a 9-to-1 ratio for hydrogen to water. And droughts are becoming more common. Ohio farmers faced a historic drought in 2024. We can expect more of that to happen in the future. So we need to conserve our water. This slide will be done by Kat Finneran.
Hello all, my name is Kat Finneran, and I'm on the board for the Buckeye Environmental Network, and I'm currently a PhD candidate in the Geography Department at Ohio State. I wanted to take a slide to contextualize ARCH2 within both the environmental and disability justice movements, as well as the now centuries-old human and ecological disablement already present in the region. It is important to note that ARCH2 is just the most recent layer in what amounts to 230 years of extractive industrial onslaught in the Greater Valley. From raw material resource extraction in the form of timber, salt, coal, oil, gas, and importantly, water, to secondary industrial production via coke, steel, aluminum, ammonia, asphalt, PFAS forever chemicals, etc., to the very commodification of the waste streams themselves via the deregulation of fracked brine waste, coal fly ash, trash burning power plants, etc., to this new insidious era of alternative energy we find ourselves in via plastics pyrolysis, coal bed methane, carbon capture utilization, and sequestration, as well as hydrogen. This layered impact on the environment might feel impossible to keep track of, yet we need not look any further than our very own bodies. Our lungs and blood act as standalone geographic archives of corporate extractive violence because environmental destruction is ultimately a story of mass disablement. Those living within and around the overlapping borderlands of the Rust Belt and Appalachia possess some of the highest rates of disability in the developed world. And the higher than national average rates of mortality occur not just through proximity to industrial and extractive violence, but also through an industry-assisted strategic disinvestment in healthcare and social safety net infrastructure, which also places the region often at the top of national rankings for infant mortality, teen pregnancy, poverty, housing insecurity, and most recently through preventable deaths from COVID-19. A pandemic that devastated a region already teetering on the edge of respiratory collapse. Furthermore, when natural resource extraction and the strategic emplacement of industries of last resort were not enough, the literal physical and emotional pain folks felt from workplace and industry disablement was itself extracted upon and sold for profit through Purdue Pharma's targeted campaign in the region, catalyzing an opiate crisis and an unprecedented wave of so-called deaths of despair, or deaths via suicide in problematic relationships to drugs. This weaponization of regional pain for extractive profit, in one way or another, remains the argument of choice underpinning a vast array of current and proposed toxic industrial investment in the valley, one snake oil salesman after the next, promising a cure to the region they themselves put on life support. But we know that ARCH2 is just the most recent iteration of this. It's business as usual for the oil and gas industry. For their imagined futures, maintain the relevance of oil and gas expertise, the value of fossil fuel assets, and the integrity of legacy infrastructure systems. Oil and gas industry experts and allies present these technologies to the public in a paternalistic way to assure us through elaborate and fatalistic reasoning that legacy energy industries care about a sustainable future. In truth, they are delay tactics serving as a political pressure release valve to stave off calls for a more rapid and fundamental energy transition. Looking at the National Hydrogen Hub map, all of the so-called winners of this program are equally regions with histories of extraction. From Cancer Alley in the Gulf region, to indigenous reservation lands in the Dakotas, to the international ports located in the historically black and brown neighborhoods of Southern California, all of these regions possessing similarly polluted zip codes and subsequent high rates of disability. The fact is that these industries profit off of not just environmental disablement, but also human disablement, accusing people of first causing mass disability and then criticizing that disability, accusing people of being unable to determine for themselves a safe and sustainable future, effectively placing us all into a conservatorship managed by fossil fuel corporations in the petro state. However, I will end this slide on this. They may be powerful, but we are not powerless. We must root ourselves fundamentally in the lessons from those two movements for justice made one by systemic extractive violence. And to pull specifically from the disability justice movement, I say, nothing about us without us. Thank you.
And now we're going to have Dr. Randy Pokladnik talk about the health and environmental impacts. She is an Eastern Ohio resident and a retired chemistry teacher and environmental scientist. Go ahead, take it away, Dr. Randy.
A little chemistry. This is the reason why they're choosing hydrogen and they're claiming it's clean energy, and theoretically with the reaction, it does only generate water vapor and energy when you burn hydrogen and oxygen. So unlike the top equation is what happens when you burn methane gas with oxygen, if you balance the equation, you actually get carbon dioxide and water molecules. So that's the simple, statement as far as, yes, it doesn't produce carbon dioxide, but there's so much more to it than just this. Next slide. Okay, so just a little background on hydrogen. I noticed on something on the Hydrogen Hub on the ARCH2 website, this has been a while ago, and I was reading it, and they said hydrogen isn't toxic. Well, no, it's technically it isn't toxic, but it's flammable and it's explosive. It's the #1 abundant element in the universe. It's extremely small. If you look at the bottom where the little hydrogen atom is, and you look at the bottom right-hand side, you see water has 2 hydrogens in it, and methane has 4 hydrogens in it. And this is basically where the hydrogen hub is going to get the hydrogen atoms from to make hydrogen gas. Diatomic gas is either from splitting a water molecule or taking them off of a methane molecule in the steam methane formation. The other thing about hydrogen is because it is so small, it can permeate a lot of different surfaces. It can go through plastic, and it can also go through steel and cause steel embrittlement. And years ago, when I worked at National Steel, I ran a scanning electron microscope. And I can tell you that when we closed the microscope and we evacuated the bell jar where we actually had our samples, hydrogen would be able to go through the stainless steel bell jar that was tweaked down. It was torqued down with screws into a soft carbon gasket, but hydrogen could go through that. That's how small that molecule is. So I know from firsthand experience, it can permeate through fittings, like metal fittings. The other part of that slide shows you a little schematic of what it looks like for hydrogen embrittlement. And this is one of the reasons why you can't repurpose steel pipelines that they've used for methane gas. Eventually, you will have this hydrogen embrittlement, and that's a chemical engineering topic. I won't get into it, but I do know that it does cause issues with steel pipes. Okay, next slide. Okay, so these are just some of the issues. I can't be all inclusive because it would take me too long. But one of the things, like the first bullet point, is that methane pipelines can only handle low hydrogen blends, and this is because of the embrittlement. So less than 20% before there's issues, with the hydrogen embrittlement, and it weakens the pipeline, and there could be explosions. And at that low percentage, those less than 20% blends only reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by 6 to 7%. So you're really not getting much benefit when you blend 20% hydrogen with 80% methane. And then the second bullet point, blending as little as 5 to 20% into existing gas pipelines can lead to that unacceptable high risk of explosions in homes or urban areas where they do have the issue of the hydrogen embrittlement. The third bullet point, it can leak through walls of plastic pipes. The plastic pipes are porous enough and the molecule is small enough, 4 to 5 times faster than methane. And it can leak through the threads on mechanical joints of steel or iron pipes 3 times faster than methane. And this is what I experienced when I ran the scanning electron microscope. And then the fourth thing that they don't mention, because I know a lot of the projects have talked about using this for residential use and piping it into homes, is that our appliances are optimized for natural gas. If you have a gas stove or a gas furnace, so blending hydrogen above 5% and up to 20%, you're going to have some dangers there because these appliances were not made to take that kind of a blend of hydrogen to methane gas. Okay, next slide. Okay, a lot of people have just glossed over this issue as far as hydrogen being a greenhouse gas. It's not a direct greenhouse gas like some of the other gases are, but it's an indirect greenhouse gas. And they've looked at it over a 100-year period where they've looked at 1 kilogram of hydrogen leads to as much global warming as 4.3 kilograms of CO2. And then the slide I'm going to show you in a minute points out how hydrogen, the chemical reactions that happen in the lower atmosphere with hydrogen and some of the other gases, these are what exacerbate the greenhouse gas issues with hydrogen. So it interacts with methane, ozone, and stratospheric water vapors, as well as aerosols. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I think the most important thing, right above the little H2, looks like a little arrow at the very bottom in the middle of that slide, you see a reaction. It says H2 plus OH gives you H and H2O. Okay, what happens in the atmosphere, and this is especially true with methane gases, we have things called free radicals, and the OH is a free radical. It's a hydroxyl radical, and it's kind of like a little detergent for the atmosphere. So it bumps up against other dangerous gases, and it removes them, or it reacts with them and takes them out of the atmosphere. So the one gas that's really important that it bumps up to, if you look to the left side of that slide where I have a number 1, is that OH radical bumps up against methane, and it takes methane out of the air. So if you don't have that OH radical free to do that, then that means the methane that the OH radical is taking out of the air on a daily basis is still present. What happens then, the OH radical reacts with the hydrogen and ties it up. So now you get an additional water molecule, which we all know the more water in the atmosphere, that's a greenhouse gas, the warmer it gets. And then you don't have that OH radical to react with the methane. Okay, some other things that it does without getting into a real deep chemistry lesson here is that it does increase, number 3, it does increase the amount of ozone. Now, ozone is great when it's up there in the troposphere. It's not so great when it's down here at ground level because it causes things like smog. So that's another reaction. So those 3 are the important reactions, which shows you how hydrogen can act as an indirect greenhouse gas. Okay, next slide. Okay, I had on the very first slide or the second slide, the little dancing, hydrogen molecule and how they were connected. The hydrogen atoms are connected to water, and they're also connected to methane. So the one of the dangerous things about this hub is it's going to promote fracking because they're going to rely on steam methane reforming to generate the hydrogen gas using the methane gas from fracking. Another way is the biogas. They're going to use anaerobic digestion. So what happens in your septic tank without oxygen, you can create methane gas in there, and then they're going to take the hydrogens off that methane to use. And then electrolysis, they'll split a water molecule using electrolyzers, and they will break that water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm not going to go into this real deep because I'm trying to keep an eye on my time, but this is just a schematic that shows what happens in steam methane reforming. And you can see, in the middle of the slide, it has hydrogen, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. These are all gases that are generated during that process. So yes, you do get hydrogen gas, but you get a lot of other gases as well. And in some cases, you even get nitrogen oxide gases. So it's not, a simple process because so much of that steam methane reforming around the world is used to make hydrogen gas, and generates enormous amounts of carbon dioxide. And that's where the carbon capture process of blue hydrogen comes into play. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is what the industry, when they talk about carbon capture and sequestration, this was a cute little cartoon. It's just really, is exactly what they think it does. It sucks all the CO2 off of the facility and then buries it underground. Like, it's just as simple as that. And it's not nearly that simple. Next slide. So this shows you some of the things that are issues with carbon capture and sequestration. One of them is the fact that when they have this CO2, it's a supercritical fluid. So it's an extremely high pressure. It's like over 1,000 PSI, just to give you an example. Like right now, we're at 14 or 15 PSI. Your bike tires, when you inflate them, are around 50 PSI. So imagine the pressure for over 1,000 PSI, shooting that down into an area where we've already got, old conventional oil wells. We've got longwall mining. We've got strip mining. We've got injection wells for brine from fracking. So you're shooting this very high pressure fluid down inside of these, cavities in the ground, and crossing your fingers that it'll stay there. Another issue is the fact that If it does start to move through the bedrock, it will cause groundwater to be acidified. So you're making carbonic acid, and people that rely on groundwater, that's going to be an issue for them. And it also will, once the water's acidified, it can dissolve some toxic metals that are down there as well. And most of the CO2 now is used for enhanced oil recovery. So will we be using that for, oil and gas recovery here, or will we actually be using it to just send down into the ground? Okay, next slide. Okay, this is just a schematic that shows you the supercritical fluid. And I mentioned already, it's around the supercritical temperature is around 87 degrees Fahrenheit. So not real hot, but it's the pressure. I mean, the pressure is really high, over 1,000 PSI. And you can imagine, when a pipeline is ruptured at that pressure, I mean, this just inundates the area. And so you've got CO2 everywhere. And it's not that CO2 is toxic, but and once there's CO2, there's no oxygen, and it will asphyxiate people. It will turn off combustion engines. You can't get emergency vehicles around. That city in Mississippi had this happen a couple of years ago. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is another form of hydrogen that they want to get. This is like your septic tank. You're going to generate methane from food waste or cellulose. I don't know where they're going to get the feedstock, but this is also energy intensive. And once you get the methane, then you're going to have to take the hydrogen off the methane molecule. So it's very energy intensive. And is this really worth the energy for the amount of hydrogen you get off the process? Okay, next slide. Okay, back in 2011, my husband and I, we live in Harrison County, just 3 miles from the Tuscarawas County line. We went to a meeting at Kent State's branch in New Philadelphia, and they were talking about this experimental injection well, and they drilled it. It's right outside of Janaden Hutton, and that's where that got it circled with the little red star. That's where it was drilled, and they were doing it mainly as a test well. And any data that I got off the internet pretty much was inconclusive. So they couldn't say the bedrock was horrible for storage of CO2, and they couldn't say it was great. But regardless of whether it was good or not, the 3 counties right to the right of that star, Carroll, Harrison, and Tuscarawas, and we live in Harrison, those are the 3 counties that are being targeted for the carbon capture sequestration projects. Okay, next slide. Okay, to be truly green hydrogen, and there's a lot of data and different benchmarks that you have to meet to get certain classifications. But truly green hydrogen would come from using the electrical method to separate a water molecule, electrolysis. But the electricity to use for that process would have to come from wind turbines or solar energy. It would have to be renewable energy. And it's going to be very expensive. Green hydrogen is very expensive. And right now, Ohio has about 4% of its electricity from renewables. So them saying that, the plug power plants are going to be green hydrogen is not really true, because in order for it to be green, it has to be from renewable. And I'm betting they're going to pull that off of the grid, and it's going to be fossil fuel energy. Another issue with green hydrogen, regardless of whether it's renewable energy, is they use electrolyzers, and the fuel cells need PFAS, the forever chemical in the ionomers, and these are just you separate the oxygen from the hydrogen in the fuel cell. It's like a barrier, and it's very toxic. And right now, if you go online and just type in PFAS regulations and green energy or hydrogen, you'll see that Europe and a lot of other countries are pushing back against PFAS regulations, because they basically are telling the governments, we can't do this, we need PFAS, we can't make these fuel cells without PFAS, so we need excluded from these regulations. And the last bullet point, there are really no federal rules or regulations for transporting hydrogen via interstate pipelines. So nobody knows if FERC's going to handle it or MFAS is going to handle it. They don't have, secure rules or regulations yet. So this is all, going to have to be developed down the road, as well as trying to find out whether they can, or if they do put in hydrogen pipelines along with the carbon capture pipelines. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just a schematic of a fuel cell, and I won't get into this real deep, but the right in the center of it, you see it says PEM membrane. That's a proton membrane where the electron can jump back and forth between the two, like a positive electrode, like you see in your car battery. And that center is where they need the PFAS coating. So it's impermeable, so the oxygen and the hydrogen can't get back together again. They're trying to, separate the water and then keep the oxygen and hydrogen apart from each other. Okay, next slide. Okay, and this is why we don't want us in our environment or anywhere, because it's such a dangerous chemical and very safe. The carbon fluorine bond is really hard to break. I mean, fluorine, if you remember chemistry class, it's the highest electronegativity of any element on the periodic table. So when it hooks up with something, it doesn't want to let go. And this is one of the reasons why the CFCs from the refrigerants were so bad for the environment and the ozone layer. They went up into the upper atmosphere, huge molecules with lots of fluorine and chlorine, very high electronegativities. And when they actually did break apart, and UV light helped that process, then they wanted to hook up to something. And what did they do? They clung to the ozone molecule and broke it apart and destroyed that ozone layer for many, many years, causing the holes above the planet and, the escalation of cancer rates and things like that. But this molecule is stable and it lasts forever. And this is another reason why we really need to question using the electrolyzers and the fuel cells. We could use electric battery, electric cars, rather than opting for something that's got these many issues with it as well. And I think that's my last slide. I hope I didn't get too chemistry oriented there.
Thank you, Dr. Randy. And now we're going to have Sean O'Leary speak from the Ohio River Valley Institute. Go ahead, Sean. You want to introduce yourself?
And each of those projects is to some degree its own creature. And so one of the challenges we've had as an organization, as a movement, is to help bring people from the states of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia together in their understanding of this project, which actually does span all three states. And so we began looking at this in detail back in 2022, and then in, I think it was September of 2023, the Ohio River Valley Institute organized a workshop for journalists to talk about some of the consequences of the hydrogen hub as it was being contemplated at that time. And I'd point out that that's before the federal government had selected any hydrogen hubs for funding at that point. Bev, can we go to the second slide? And at the time that we did the workshop, we pointed out that there was an inherent problem with an Appalachian hydrogen hub. And that was, and I'll just read directly from the slide, because hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestration are economic for only a few industries, which generate very little demand for hydrogen, an Appalachian hydrogen and carbon capture hub will either be a small affair that has disappointingly little economic or environmental impact, or on the other hand, hydrogen and carbon capture will be force-fed into applications for which they're not economic, and that would result in higher prices, utility bills, and higher taxes with little or no economic benefit. And unfortunately, that prophecy has turned out essentially to be true. Bev, if we can go to the next slide. And the part of it that's coming true is that because of that dearth of demand that we just saw a moment ago, the underlying economics of the hydrogen hub are basically coming apart. Many ARCH2 projects are being developed by undercapitalized, largely notional companies that have no history of success in developing and operating large-scale facilities. And as a result of that, when you go back to September of 2023, or October rather, when the Department of Energy announced the 7 hydrogen hubs nationally, at that time, the ARCH2 hub had 15 development partners, and 15 projects. In the ensuing year, a third of the projects and a third of the partners dropped out. And that's because for various reasons, they found the projects that they were proposing to be uneconomic. And of the projects that remain, many of them are still heavily troubled. Could we go to the next slide? This map summarizes both the original projects, which are in black ink, as well as the projects in red ink that have dropped out of the ARCH2 hydrogen hub. And you'll notice that the projects span all three states. And this is a significant problem for the ARCH2 hydrogen hub because, of course, its ability to command subsidies from the federal government and investment from investors turns in large part on its ability to demonstrate its viability as a business, because although the federal government has earmarked $925 million to help develop the ARCH2 hub, that represents only about 10 to 15% of the actual capital that will be required to build all of these projected facilities that are out there. And right now, the hydrogen hub is having trouble finding investors who are willing to fork over money to subsidize or to add to what the federal government is kicking in. Could we go to the next slide? And we're seeing the effects of that. As I said a moment ago, a third of the projects that were part of the original ARCH2 hub have already evaporated. And just this past week, the federal government announced its rule regarding the availability of tax credits for clean hydrogen. And in issuing its final rule, one of the remaining key developers of the ARCH2 hub, CNX, which many of us know as a gas production company, found that their proposal for basically deploying methane that's gathered from coal mines and from landfills and other things will not qualify for the highest level of subsidy available under the 45V tax credit. And as a consequence of that, along with the other companies who have seen their stocks collapse and either drop out of the hydrogen hub, CNX since this past Friday has seen its stock drop by nearly 20% as a result of that particular ruling. So, in other words, the savaging of the ARCH2 projects is continuing and further calling into question the economic viability. And I point that out because for all of us who are concerned, primarily for health and environmental reasons, as well as economic reasons about what's going on, it's important for us to understand that although the federal government is kicking in hundreds of millions of dollars for the hydrogen hub, that doesn't mean it's a done deal. It's far from a done deal, and it can, in fact, be stopped. And I've kind of kidded Bev Reed about this a little bit, but I got to know Bev a few years ago when she was helping to lead a group called Concerned Ohio River Residents about a proposed ethane cracker plant in Belmont County, Ohio. And that project, of course, has since evaporated, largely for economic reasons. And then Bev turned her attention to Austin Master in Martins Ferry, Ohio, and that business collapsed. So she's got a pretty good track record, but more than that, it's not just Bev. We as a region have a pretty effective track record of reversing or seeing these kinds of projects go by the wayside. And I say that only because I want to encourage everybody to remain involved, because despite the fact that the federal government is kicking in hundreds of millions of dollars, that doesn't mean this has to happen. And in fact, it probably won't. Bev, if we could go to the next slide. But that doesn't mean that the industry isn't going to continue trying. ARCH2, having lost a third of its developers and a third of its projects, is out there right now recruiting new projects. This past fall, they sent out a request for information to companies generally, asking people to come along. And in their flyer, they even advertised the fact that they had $110 million of federal tax money to hand out. So they're now in the process of collecting proposals from various companies for new projects. So we can expect in the coming months to see ARCH2 coming out with announcements about new projects being added to the list that are currently surviving. Bev, if we can go to the next one. And I'd also like to mention that ARCH2, which is a collaboration of a variety of different developers of various hydrogen products or projects, isn't the only game in town. In addition to the 10 or so ARCH2 projects that are still hanging out there in limbo and trying to find financing, there are about 3 dozen other hydrogen-related projects that are out there, but that are not specifically part of ARCH2, although they may become part of ARCH2 as a result of the new solicitation. And right now, we're looking at a couple of those in our region. One of them is SARTA, the Stark Area Regional Transit Authority, is trying to purchase and operate a number of hydrogen-powered buses. And also I'm trying to think, um, Bev, the project for heating and powering homes, it's in Hudson, Ohio, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. In Hudson, Ohio, we're talking about a community that would see its homes powered by hydrogen, which, if you go back to what Dr. Randy told us a moment ago, raises some real concerns about health, safety, and also the economics of it. And so it's important that we realize that while the ARCH2 project gives us a focal point for advocacy and things against which we need to work, we also need to be conscious of other hydrogen-related projects that are being proposed around the area. Bev, if we could go to the next one. And I also want to point out that we're still fairly early in the process. This is a graphic that comes from the Department of Energy that describes the process through which the hydrogen hubs have to progress in order to attain full funding. So far, the ARCH2 Hydrogen Hub has only received about $35 million of the $925 million that have been earmarked for it. And to get the other nearly $900 million. The Hydrogen Hub and its individual projects have to fulfill a number of conditions. And again, as we see various projects collapse and go by the wayside, and we see ARCH2's efforts to try to backfill, they're doing so in part because their failure to be able to bring these projects to fruition threaten their ability to get federal money. This is another area in which that gives us opportunity as advocates to have an impact and to help discourage development of many of these projects that truly are counterproductive and dangerous. And you'll notice as you look at this slide that the period of time over which the funding will take place is counted in years, specifically 3 to 4 years, before many of these projects would actually arrive at a state where they would receive full federal funding. So although it does again seem like the ARCH2 Hydrogen Hub is screaming along and we hear and see announcements constantly, in fact, it is still at a very fledgling state of existence that gives us a lot of opportunity as advocates to have influence about what happens. Next slide. And so the open house that's going to be taking place in a couple of days in North Canton is an example of a very early stage effort by the ARCH2 hub to reach out to communities that are going to be affected. They've already had a session like this one in southern West Virginia. And although it's been temporarily postponed because of the weather issues, they're going to have another session like this in Washington County, Pennsylvania, relatively shortly as well. These are open houses in which, at least based on the West Virginia open house, ARCH2 has had a few of its development partners bring displays to a meeting hall, and in kind of science fair fashion, they allow folks from the community to go around and talk. Unfortunately, what has not been provided to date have been opportunities for a real public hearing where we see and hear representatives from ARCH2 and the federal government, and where citizens like us have the opportunity to question them about the details of this. Now, I don't know exactly how the open house in North Canton is going to be conducted, but if it's like the one in southern West Virginia, it may be somewhat frustrating from an advocacy standpoint, because the science fair format where you can basically circulate from table to table to meet, a developer or somebody who has some kind of display doesn't really lend itself to effective questions and answers in which the entire community can engage. But I hope that, all of you who can be there will try to attend this and make a point of expressing your concerns to the folks who are there from the ARCH2 developers. Next slide. And I just want to point out to you that you're not alone in your concern. A couple of months ago, the Ohio River Valley Institute organized a letter to the Department of Energy expressing concerns about the community engagement process. And as you can see from this slide, which will be shared with everybody, we at that time managed to attract 54 organizations from Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia to express their share of concern about what was happening. In other words, we're not in this alone. There are a lot of organizations and a lot of individuals out there who are expressing concern and advocating against hydrogen hub projects. Next slide. And so when we wrote the petition to the Department of Energy, to which all of those organizations signed on, we were asking for a number of very fundamental things. The first was that the hydrogen hub disclose all of the information necessary to the public to understand what's being proposed, because in most cases, we don't yet even know the locations of the projects. There are a few for which we do know the locations, but for most, we do not. And we know very little about the technology, nor has the Department of Energy shared the submissions that ARCH2 have made to DOE in order to receive funding. So there are a great many questions that are out there. The second thing is that the hydrogen hubs generally, and ARCH2 in particular, have not really worked with communities to discuss, to even reveal what the economic and health and environmental impacts of their facilities are likely to be. And then finally, we asked the Department of Energy to suspend negotiations with the hydrogen hub until those first two conditions were met. And I can tell you that since the petition was submitted, DOE has responded and they declined our request to suspend negotiations with ARCH2. So that process is proceeding. Next slide. And I also wanted to mention to you that in addition to the concerns that we're feeling and trying to express at a regional level, there is an organization called the CO2 Plenary, which is organized by a woman by the name of Carolyn Raffensperger, and they operate on a national basis. And you'll see that in the slide, I've included Carolyn's contact information because she brings together experts as well as advocacy groups from all regions of the country who are seeing the development of hydrogen hubs, and particularly those like the ARCH2 hub that are driven primarily by carbon capture and sequestration and all of the ills associated with that. So if you need further information and you want to engage at a more national scale, please feel free to reach out to Carolyn and her group. Next slide. And finally, I just want to mention that, as we all know, we're going through a change of government right now, a change of administrations. And we frankly don't know what the impacts of a Trump administration are likely to be, because while on the one hand, much of the motivation to develop a hydrogen hub in our region is driven by the natural gas industry and the oil industry, which is something that President-elect Trump tends to support very highly. At the same time, it's being done ostensibly for the purpose of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and for environmental reasons, which is something that President Trump has not been particularly interested in. So we really don't know at this moment, how much of the Inflation Reduction Act is likely to remain intact. We don't know how much of the federal funding that's been earmarked for hydrogen hubs is actually going to come through. And so, in a bizarre way, even though the Trump administration is likely to be generally antagonistic to environmental and health concerns, at the same time, it may not be particularly sympathetic to programs like the hydrogen hubs that exist ostensibly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and address other environmental concerns. But we do know that some of the people who are likely to make up the administration are very supportive of both carbon capture and hydrogen development. And specifically, I've mentioned Lee Zeldin of New York, who's been nominated or is going to be nominated to run DOE or EPA, and Chris Wright, who is a fracking executive from Colorado, who is going to be nominated to run the Department of Energy. So I just encourage you to stay tuned if you can to the Ohio River Valley Institute and other organizations that are tracking what's happening, because as we come up to this, to President Trump taking office at the end of January, there's going to be a lot of news breaking, which may directly influence what choices not only we make, but also that the ARCH2 hydrogen hub makes. Next slide. I'm sorry. Could you go to the next slide, Bev?
I think that's the last one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Then that means that I'm done. And to say
Okay.
thank you all very much for being here. I am grateful for the opportunity.